If you take a moment to be in prayer with me, please. Gracious God, thank you so much for the privilege of being the pastor in this place. Thank you for those who so faithfully come, and thank you for the privilege we have of taking time to look at your word. I offer to you now the words that I prepare, trusting that as we hear them, each one of us will hear something that is in keeping with the needs that we have for this day. Thank you again for this privilege. In Christ's name. Amen. So, Jacob is one of those characters that, if you remember your Old Testament, is sort of like an Old Testament Peter. He's got enough flaws that you can relate to him, and yet see that he continued to pursue God, and that relationship between Jacob and God did, in the end, make a strong bond. And so he's just a good example of how human you can be and still be in relationship with God. And I think that's important because sometimes we think about the New Testament call to be Christ-like, and that seems completely beyond us. But we can be like Jacob, oftentimes without even thinking about it. But Jacob truly had a colorful life. Do you remember the story? He ended up having to flee from his brother because he had tricked his brother into selling him the birthright that should have gone to Esau, because Esau was the oldest son. And because he tricked his brother, he had to flee. And the place he fled to was his mother's homeland, the place that she had come from. And when he got there, he's fled hundreds of miles. He shows up basically with nothing to his name except his name. He stops at a well to get a drink. The shepherds are bringing their sheep up. Young woman brings her sheep. Jacob asks after his mother's family. It was Laban, and he says, "Oh, that's my family, come on home with me." So he waters her sheep and they go home. Laban welcomes him in, and he becomes part of the family. But he's fallen in love with Rachel, his cousin, and wants to marry her, and Father Laban, no. So 7 years Jacob works in order to pay the bride price to have Rachel as his wife. But the trickster Jacob gets tricked himself. And I'm not quite sure how they pulled this off, but wedding night comes and it is Leah that becomes the wife of Jacob, not Rachel. And so Jacob's all upset, but what can he do? This is the custom of the land. You can't marry off the younger daughter before the older. He works another 7 years so that he might have Rachel as his wife. And then he's thinking it's about time to go home. And so he makes a deal with his father-in-law that he would have the sheep and goats of the herd that were dark or speckled. And if you haven't read this part of the story, you need to go in and read it because it's really kind of funny. But that part of the herd keeps increasing in numbers, and so Jacob keeps getting richer. So this blessing that he's stolen from his brother is paying off even in a foreign land. But the brothers-in-law, the sons of Laban, are now all upset because their father's sheep and goats are going to somebody else. And so they are angry. So Jacob decides this is a good time to go home. And in the midst of the night, he takes his whole family and he disappears with the sheep and the goats and wives and grandkids, and off he goes. But he didn't make any of the farewells that are so much a part of that culture and that tradition. And so Laban chases after him and catches him. And the excuse was that the household gods from Laban's house had been stolen. Well, Jacob says, I didn't take them. You can search. Jacob really hadn't taken them. Rachel had. But they stayed hidden. Laban went home. Jacob went on his way. Now, he's just left one big family mess behind. But what he's facing going home is Esau. And Esau was so angry he wanted to kill his brother at the time the birthright was stolen. And so that's what Jacob thinks is ahead of him. Now, he gets to this place called Peniel. He's getting close enough to Esau that he's really worried now. And he's trying to find a way to continue to do this Jacob's way, right? He's really good at hustling, working the system, figuring out how to do things his way. And sometimes it worked. I mean, he ended up with all the sheep and goats, right? But sometimes it didn't work so well for him. And that's why he's in this mess. But he's still trying to figure out how to do it Jacob's way. And so he sends ahead pieces of his flocks and herds, and then he spaces those with his family and more herds, all as offerings to his brother because he knew the direction his brother was going to be coming from. And now it's night, everyone's gone ahead, he's set all of this up, and he's left with just Jacob in the dark. Now, when he had fled originally, he had an encounter with God. He had a dream. He had made a commitment to God. But that was a long time ago, and he hadn't had a whole lot of encounter with God between then and now. And now he's in this place. And those household gods that Rachel had brought with him were real and present, and Jacob was having a really hard time coping with a God that wasn't present. But he knew he had made a mess of everything. And he knew that he needed somebody's help because he just wasn't going to get it on his own. And into that place and time, into Jacob's need, God appeared. Now, when God appeared to Moses, it was a burning bush, right? When God appeared to Isaiah, it was this great wind. God appeared to Jacob as the incarnate God, as a physical being, somebody Jacob could see, touch, talk to. Jacob needed a God that was present, and so God was present for Jacob. Now, it's a kind of funny way to be present, right? You end up in a wrestling match with the person you think might be God. Just saying it's hilarious, isn't it? To think that you can overcome God in a wrestling match. But Jacob finally understood that God was what Jacob needed. And the wrestling match was, I think, very much internal. Was Jacob going to continue to be Jacob's God, or was Jacob going to allow God to be God? And in the end, Jacob didn't overcome God, but he also refused to let go of God. And the blessing that he received was the blessing of no longer having to be Jacob. He was blessed with a name change, which meant that now that God was present, Israel, El is the word for God. He is now named after God. And now God is the one that will be directing Jacob's being, with Jacob's permission. God didn't come come into our lives and force us to do things, it's always with our permission. But back to that idea of wrestling. Do any of you ever wrestle with God? I know a couple of you do because you've talked to me about the things you wrestle with God about. And those things are these big ideas, these how could it possibly be kinds of things. But I suspect we all wrestle with God to some extent or another fairly often. Sometimes over big things, sometimes over little things, sometimes over just getting up and doing the things we need to do because we know we need to do them. There's always that, but God, I don't want to. I may have shared this story with you before about my great wrestling match with God. It happened in the mid to late 90s, and there was great turmoil in my home church. And in that great turmoil, several of the church's elders felt that they needed to not be there anymore. And the man that was the head of the elders, and for those of you that are disciples, you know that elders are a very prominent and important part of the leadership of a disciples' church. They function sort of like the diaconate plus, diaconate turbo, whatever. But there was this turmoil, and the man that was the head of the elders came to me one day and said, I've been praying about it, I think that you need to be the head of elders. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he says, you can't tell me no, because you haven't prayed about it. And my response was, and it was exactly this, okay, I'll pray about it, but the answer's still no. Anybody ever done that? Anyway, time went along. This elder and his family left the church. There was no chair for the elders group. There were things in the church that needed the leadership of the elders, and without a chair, it wasn't going very well. So there was an elders meeting called, and I chose not to go. Next month, the elders meeting was called, and one of the elders had let everyone know that he was volunteering to be the chair of the elders, which seemed perfectly appropriate. He was the elder of longest standing, and that seemed the right thing. And so I showed up to the elders meeting, and the first thing he said was, I don't know who is supposed to be the chair of elders, but it's not me. God's made that clear. I'm resigning. I kept my mouth shut. Another month went by. The situation was getting very difficult. The regional minister came and set up an elders retreat. So I went. And about halfway through the day, it became really apparent I couldn't just sit there and keep my mouth shut any longer. And they said, I think maybe I'm being called to be the chair of the elders. And the elder that had resigned said, I was wondering how long it was going to take you to finally speak up. I became the chair of the elders. I saw that congregation through the last year of a very long ministry. The pastor that left had been there 38 years. I was there through a year of the interim's ministry. I was the chair of the elders through the first year of the new pastor's ministry, and then I went to seminary. I was disobedient, and I was wrestling with God because I didn't want to do what God called me to do. There are consequences to choosing not to do what you're called to do, and I know that there were relationships destroyed and people who left that didn't need to if I had been obedient. I can't change that. It is a consequence of my actions. It doesn't mean that I haven't been forgiven, and I have worked at forgiving myself. But sometimes, as we wrestle with God, we try to keep God from having the impact our hearts need from God. What are you you wrestling with God at? What is it in your life that you're holding on to that would be better that God had? Maybe you're not wrestling with anything right now, but I'm willing to bet that there's been some time in your life you've had that kind of wrestling match. What sorts of things cause us to be God of our own life instead of God? Yeah? For that 6 months, I was God of my own life, and it didn't work very well. Doesn't make it perfect when we decide to let God have control. But it sure works better than we tried to do it completely on our own. So I would ask you to think about the wrestling matches that you're having with God. And maybe that